So let's dive into a really fascinating diplomatic puzzle that's unfolding around President Trump. We're talking about a huge success in one major conflict and a really frustrating struggle in another. How can the very same leader get such wildly different results? We're going to break it all down.
On the one hand, you have what's being called a celebrated achievement. Trump's team managed to broker a ceasefire and a hostage release deal in Gaza. But then, on the other hand, you have the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for nearly 4 years now, and his efforts there have just completely stalled out.
And that really brings us to the core question here, right? How could the same administration, with the same guy who calls himself the ultimate dealmaker, pull off one, but not the other? What was the secret sauce in Gaza that seems to be missing in Ukraine?
To figure that out, let's start by taking a closer look at the Gaza success. If we can understand what made that deal actually happen, it'll start to become pretty clear what's not working in the other conflict.
So right after the ink was dry on the Gaza ceasefire, President Trump apparently turned straight to his lead negotiator, Steve Witkoff, and gave him a new mission. He just said, "We have to get Russia done." The goal was obvious. Let's do it again, and let's do it now.
But as we're about to see, it is just not that simple. The key that unlocked the whole Gaza deal, and the very reason the Ukraine situation is so different, it all comes down to one critical idea in diplomacy: leverage.
So what is diplomatic leverage exactly? Well, think of it as your ability to get someone to do something they don't really want to do. It's having the right mix of rewards and punishments, carrots and sticks, to nudge them toward an agreement they wouldn't make on their own. It's basically the currency of any big negotiation.
And what's really interesting here is where the U.S. got its leverage in Gaza. You had an Israeli attack on Hamas negotiators that, kind of weirdly, created a new opening. You had Trump's long track record of pro-Israel policies, which gave him a ton of credibility there. And get this, he was actually more popular in Israel than Prime Minister Netanyahu, which gave him this unique personal influence. You add that to the strong U.S. relationships with key Arab countries, and suddenly you've got a whole lot of diplomatic muscle to flex.
Okay, so now let's switch gears and look at the stalemate in Ukraine. Because when we use that same idea of leverage to look at the war between Russia and Ukraine, well, a very, very different picture starts to take shape. And here it is, laid out as simply as possible. In Gaza, the U.S. was working from a position of high leverage. In Ukraine, that leverage is, well, it's pretty low. And that right there is the heart of the problem.
Now, to be fair, Trump has definitely tried to create leverage. I mean, over the last 9 months, he's been swinging back and forth, trying to pressure both sides. He's threatened Russia with new sanctions and talked about sending new advanced weapons to Ukraine. But then he's also turned around and publicly criticized President Zelensky and even temporarily cut off intelligence and weapon shipments. But so far, none of it has led to a breakthrough.
This chart just lays out the contrast perfectly. Look at it. In Gaza, the U.S. had high influence over the key leader, Netanyahu. In Ukraine, low influence over both Putin and Zelensky. In the Middle East, regional allies were pretty much on the same page as the U.S. In Europe, things are way more complicated and cautious. And finally, in Gaza, there were lots of different pressure points you could use, but in Ukraine, the options are just much more limited.
Okay, now this is where the plot really thickens. The source material that we're digging into here asks a pretty provocative question. Is it possible that Vladimir Putin is actually using Trump's intense desire to make a deal against him?
Let's just walk through the timeline, because a pattern really seems to jump out. Back in July, right when the U.S. was about to hit Russia with new sanctions, Putin agrees to a summit. And what happens? The sanctions get put on hold. Then, just last week, as the White House was thinking about sending powerful missiles to Ukraine, Putin picks up the phone and calls Trump. Suddenly, everyone's talking about another summit. And the very next day, Trump meets with Zelensky and Ukraine gets nothing.
And Ukraine's President Zelensky himself has called this out. He basically said that as soon as the threat of those new weapons went away, Russia's interest in talking just seemed to evaporate. It's a pretty direct accusation, really, that Russia is just dangling the idea of talks to avoid any real military consequences.
So what about President Trump? For his part, he just confidently brushes this whole idea aside. His response is pretty much, "I'm a master negotiator. Nobody plays me." So you have two completely different ways of reading the exact same events.
So what does all of this actually tell us? Well, it points to a much bigger truth, not just about these conflicts, but about the very nature of making deals on the world stage.
You might remember, back on the campaign trail, Trump famously promised he could end the Ukraine war in a matter of hours.
But since then, he's had to walk that back, admitting that the reality on the ground is proving to be, in his own words, harder than he expected.
And honestly, this is a pretty fascinating moment. It's a rare thing to hear from a leader who has built his entire brand on his deal-making skills, an admission that he's bumping up against the limits of his own power. It just goes to show you that some conflicts are just tangled up in strategic realities that even the biggest personality can't just wish away.
And that kind of leaves us with this final big question to think about. When it comes to actually making peace, what's more important? The skill and the personality of the person at the table, or the fundamental circumstances of the deal itself? That's the real puzzle here.